We are joined by three people with really remarkable experience in building community, and I think we can learn a tremendous amount this evening. My goal is to sort of do a Jewish version of Meet the Press, but hopefully a little more unity. I do work in Washington, D.C., so unity is not our specialty, but I'm going to try to raise the bar this evening, hopefully. Rabbi Aaron Kotler is the CEO of BMG Lakewood Yeshiva. We're joined from him tonight. Please welcome him. Mr. Howard Tzvi Friedman, who is the chairman of the board of the OU, the chairman of the Lakewood Yeshiva, and a former chairman and past president of AIPAC. And Mr. Mark Moshe Bain, who is the president of the OU. So the goal of this conversation is to really learn about leaders and building community and inspiration. And so I want to begin with the question of each of you, which is, if you think about your past and all your experiences in the Jewish community, which community leader is or was your role model and inspiration, and why? And Howard, please begin.
Sure. For me, that's a very easy question. I was fortunate to have a mentor who I talked to 3 to 4 times a day for 20 years, day in, day out. And that's the legendary President Manal of Yeshivas Ner Yisrael in Baltimore, Rabbi Herman Naftali Neuberger, who was someone who cared for every single Jew. Let me just tell you one quick story. I'm sitting in his office one day, and he has to run to the funeral home up the block, the Jewish funeral home. I said, "Why are you going there, Rabbi Neuberger?" He said, "The composer died. You saw it, the famous composer. You saw it on the front page of the paper." I go, "Yes, of course I saw it, but I didn't know you knew him. He didn't have much to do with Judaism." Because I don't know him. I go, "Why are you going?" He goes, "I'm going because it said, didn't you read the article? It said he was going to be cremated. And I asked for a meeting with the family to convince them not to cremate him, because according to Jewish law, you can't cremate him." So he went. A couple hours later when I spoke to him, I said, "So Rabbi Neuberger, how'd it go? Did you convince him?" He goes, "I think they're going to think about it. They're going to let me know. I made a very good pitch, but they told me at the end, but Rabbi, don't think you're going to get the funeral out of this." Woe to them who he thought he did that because he was getting the funeral. Here was a legendary leader of Klal Yisrael, a man who talked to senators and world leaders and Jewish leaders, and he cared about the Pintel Yid, every single Jew. And that's what he taught me. And I think that's something that the Kollel does here. And if I may digress for a second, it's a true honor and pleasure for me to be on this panel with my two very dear friends and community leaders, Moshe Bain and Rabbi Aaron Kotler. They, as you know, they're Mechatanim. Now, I don't get the credit, but one day we were taking a group of people through the Lakewood Yeshiva, right? I was with Rabbi Kotler, and we ran into Moshe Bain's son. And I said to Rabbi Kotler then, "Moshe Bain's son would be great for your daughter." Now, some other shadchan read the shidduch, so I never got my check, and that'll be a vote for a long time. Thank you. Yeah, I do. But anyway, they came together as a great family, and before that, they knew each other.
Next, please.
Well, I must tell you, first of all, thank you for having myself and Howard and Rabbi Kotler. It's really a privilege to be here with you. You know, the earlier comment by Rabbi Mintz was that it's so remarkable to be able to get us here together. I think anybody around the country who's familiar with the Kollel in St. Louis knows how compelling it was for each of us to make the time to be here with you tonight to support the Kollel, because the support is totally appropriate, and we encourage you all to continue it. I think that, first of all, I also shared with Howard Tzvi the mentorship of Rabbi Neuberger. You know, through the yeshiva system, most of our mentors, most of our models were great rabbis who knew enormous amount of scholarship and were daunting in their range of Torah knowledge. And it gave us the impression at certain points that in order to have an impact on the community, you needed to be a great Torah scholar. And what we learned from Rabbi Neuberger, who was a Torah knowledgeable person, but was not known as a Torah scholar, was that one is not dependent on the other. That every Jew, regardless of their degree of scholarship and knowledge, has an ability to have an impact on the community, because the true source of that impact is the love of the Jewish people. Obviously, knowledge, familiarity with Torah values and Torah information is helpful, but is nowhere near as important as the love you need to have for every Jew. But I want to share with you another individual who also had a very important impact on me, and it was, once again, a person who I didn't dare seek to emulate, but rather to learn from. And that was probably the most significant lay leader of the 20th century Orthodox community, and that was Zev Wolfson, Olav Shalom. Zev Wolfson was an individual who lived in New York. He was born in Europe and grew up in New York. And he was really probably the most impactful individual on the outreach movement in the 20th century. And I was privileged to spend a lot of time with him talking about various projects that he initiated and he funded of enormous proportion. I just want to share with you one conversation we had on a Pesach Chol Hamoed walk that we were taking. And we were going for a very long walk, and I was asking him all kinds of questions. He was not a young man, and I was a relatively young person trying to learn from him. And at one point, we started talking about great rabbis. And I said, Mr. Wolfson, could you share with me a rabbi who really impressed you? And he said, well, the only rabbi who really, really impressed me was Rav Aaron Kotler, Rabbi Kotler's grandfather. And he described how much fire he had and how much commitment he had and how much he grew American Orthodoxy. And he said to me, you know, what do you think makes a person great? I thought about it for a few minutes, thinking, okay, what makes a person great? And I gave him the answer that I thought he would be expecting. I said, what makes a person great is maximizing their potential. And Mr. Wilson said to me, Bain, that's not great. That's good. That's what you're supposed to do, is to maximize your potential. I said, so what's great? He goes, a person is great when they transcend their potential, when they do more than they're capable of doing. And what I learned from that was that if we go through our daily lives trying to impact the world, thinking that it's our own power, our own talent, our own capability, then the most we could hope for is to maximize our potential. But when we realize that our work for the community and even for our families is really just a conduit for the influence of God, and we're the handiwork of God, then we're no longer limited by who we are. We could transcend who we are, and we could all strive to become great.
Terrific. Rabbi Kotler.
I'm at a little bit of a disadvantage, because if I argue with Howard, he's chairman of my board, I'll be in a lot of trouble. And if I argue with my Mechutin, I'll be in even worse trouble. So I second what what they both said, both about Zev Wolfson and about Rabbi Neuberger. And in fact, when I started in Lakewood, I had no idea what I was doing, and I went to Rabbi Neuberger, who was my cousin, and I said, Uncle Herman, please give me some advice, which he gave me 3 priceless pieces of advice, which I will not say publicly here. But when we think of people who are inspirational and who really, as Moshe said, transcend the very notions of inspiration and leadership, I think of the Manchester Rosh Hashiva, Rav Segal. And allow me to digress for a moment. Any of you who are involved in public life, you know that it can get pretty tough, whether you're running a yeshiva, a kollel, whether you're lay leadership, whether you're just trying to be involved in a shul, a school, anything good, it gets tough, and there are a lot of personalities involved, especially among the Jewish people. And sometimes we tend to think that because we're here to serve Hashem and we're doing the right thing, that maybe we could take a little bit of leeway, not in the ideals we're pursuing, but in the way we go about it. And what I learned from the Manchester Rosh Hashiva was he never spoke a word of Lashon Hara in his life. He would not say an ill word about another person. And there was nothing one can do to get him to say, to imply, even to wink, to nod, to, in the slightest shading, to say something poor about another person. And although in the city that he was in, Manchester, he was the community leader, and I'm sure there was no shortage of potential machlokas there, no shortage of personalities, no shortage of clashes, you could not get a bad word out of him. And I think of that today because that's not a standard that I am anywhere near, but that to me is the most inspirational aspect of Jewish leadership.
Thank you very much. Now, before you answer the next question, I want to emphasize this is an off-the-record conversation, right? This is a very intimate discussion. Nothing will leave this room, I'm sure. So let me pose the following. What was your first major community project failure, and how did you get over the setback? Howard.
Go to me. I've obviously failed many times because if you don't fail, you'll never get anywhere. But I have to say, I can't remember my first because I'm too old, but let me go to my most major one. And that was, of course, the Iran deal. I was chairman of a group called Citizens Against a Nuclear Iran. I spent years of my life working to stop Iran from getting the JCPOA, the nuclear deal, done. And I was fortunate, as you know, I was active in Washington, to know many elected officials. And I got to know Barack Obama as a state senator and developed a relationship with him. And I've developed a relationship with senators and presidents on both sides of the aisle. And Obama and I developed a friendship, and here he ended up as president. He has been to my home as president of the United States. I've been in his motorcade. I've been to the Oval Office. I've been to state dinners. Why am I telling you all this? Because when the Iran thing came along, I was at every single meeting about Iran. And when the big meeting happened, the third time I sat with him, I prepared for 2.5 hours, and I prepared with my two colleagues, said, are you sure you have the guts to go up against the President of the United States when his purpose is to get the dozen of you in the room and convince you that he's right? I go, I've prepared for this my whole life. And for 20 minutes of the hour and 10-minute meeting was me and him having a back and forth. I remember I began my discussion with him saying, Mr. President, I just want to let you know, obviously, I disagree with you. There's good news and bad news. The bad news is I disagree with you on your Iran policy. The good news is I agree with you on more things than I agree with my wife on. I was trying to tell him it wasn't personal. Needless to say, after that meeting, right, I was banished from the White House. I was not invited to the White House for a full year. Now, he didn't know about it. And the reason I know that, because about 8 months later, he ran into my wife at some event, and he goes to my wife, where's Howard? I haven't seen him in ages. And my wife had to hold back from saying, yeah, because you didn't invite him to the White House anymore. You don't invite him anymore. I mean, I got invited to some second-tier things, but I didn't go. I went to, like, the last party before he went, but for a year, I was banished. But you know what? I was proud of that banishment. I was upset that I failed. We failed as a community. It's obviously not me. It was we as a community failed. And we failed because it's very hard to go up against the President of the United States, the most powerful person on the free world. But I was sure I was right. And to this, I'll go to my deathbed, sure I was right, although maybe in 13 years, now 11 years from now, the people of Iran, the pro-democracy movements, the student groups will overturn the government. If they do that, that will be the only way he was right? But I believe that was a small chance going to happen, and still is a small chance that's going to happen. And we can't allow Iran to have nuclear weapons, because the very stake of the survival of Israel is at stake with that. And that's, in that way, the Jewish people. So obviously I failed in that. But that didn't stop me from going forward and now trying to figure out what we could do next to keep Israel as safe as we can, to keep America as safe as we can.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Mr. Bain.
Well, I obviously failed because I never got invited to the Obama White House.
That was a success, by the way.
Yes, exactly. If you ask him. I was invited to the Bush White House plenty also.
I'm joking. It was a joke. It was a joke.
You know, I started with failures very, very young. When I was in second grade, I lost out to be the father at the model Pesach Seder. In seventh grade, I lost running for secretary of the student council. In fact, I remember I thought I was being cute, and I made the placard in my campaign, vote for Bain, the fastest pen in the West, and they crossed out the S and put another T. And it was always very, very bad for me when I was young. And then I got older, and my challenge at that point was marrying my wife. It was a very big challenge. The way it works, and by the way, my wife is a shadchan, so I very often will tell young fellows who are getting older and not getting married, you know, the reason you're not getting married is because there's a point system in shidduchim. And depending on the society, depending on the culture, there are different things that count for different points. But, you know, you guys, you're solid 40s. And you want to marry a girl who has all these things, you know, you're going to use up all your points on these things, you're going to get a terrible person. So when I was going out with my wife, I was a solid 25, and she was a solid 95, and she didn't want to marry me. And I had to run after her for about 6 months, and she was very smart. She didn't want to marry me. And finally, I pulled out my ace in the hole, and I said to her, do you understand that I'm going to change world Jewry? This is your shot at being partners in that effort. And she actually bought it. And we got married, and we're married for a couple of months, and she, Baruch Hashem, thank God, became pregnant. But the downside was she was very sick through all of our children's pregnancies, all of her pregnancies with our children. And we were married about 9 months, and she was pregnant about 7 months. It was Pesach. And I don't know if any of you know my wife. She is like the sweetest, nicest person you could meet. She has never said anything angry to anyone. She never said anything angry to me, except for one time. So Pesach, we were away for Pesach at a hotel with my parents and her parents, and I was having a great time. I was playing tennis and going swimming, and she was basically lying in bed throwing up, and it was just not fun for her. And one day I come back to the room, and I'm changing, and the only time, we're now married, Kanai and Hara, 34 years, the only time she ever said anything cross to me, she picks up her head and she goes, you know, we're married 9 months. You haven't changed anything in Klal Yisrael. And it was a panic. I panicked. It was like the worst thing. If you can't impress your wife, it's downhill from there. So I spent the next 3-4 months trying to find something that I could do to impress her, because that's really what you try to do, is impress those who you love. And I started at that time a project. I was just graduating law school, and we started a project called Kayama, which was an organization that encourages non-Orthodox Jews to get a religious get, a religious divorce, when they get divorced. And thank God it's been around for many, many years. But that summer, when I was trying to raise money for this nascent project, and I was a kid just graduating law school who never raised the money from anybody, I certainly didn't know what it meant to ask people for anything. It was a disaster, asking people for money.
I gave you a check.
What? You said no.
Lie.
So it was the frustration of asking people to support an important cause that you believe in. That takes enormous resilience. The ability to ask for help and to be rejected and keep on going. That was at a very young age an incredibly important lesson to me, knowing that perseverance, keeping on asking, and don't take things personally, but knowing that whatever you're doing for the right reason, it gives you the ability to keep on going.
I want to second what Moshe said about his wife being an exceptional shotsman. And although initially we were resistant, I will tell you that Joanne Bain is exceptionally persuasive. And Howard, of course, gets an honorable mention there, too. So I was kicked out of a bunch of yeshivas. I went through 11 yeshivas, and I usually, if I wasn't being kicked out, I was one step ahead of the law. So I understood that. My father wisely did not kick me out of Lakewood. So I guess he had my mother to contend with. And the few yeshivas, sometimes I've kind of made my way back in. And I think I learned from that it really doesn't make a difference. And allow me to explain that. Those yeshivas that were busy kicking me out, they did not believe in me. But my mother did, and I did. And that's what mattered. So my mother never gave up on me. And it was probably pretty embarrassing for the Rosh Yeshiva of the biggest yeshiva in the world to be called by some 30-year-old rabbi to say, I'm really sorry to say, but we have to ask your son to leave. And then that happened again and again. And my mother never stopped believing in me. And because of that, I never stopped believing in me. And I now run the biggest yeshiva in the world. So if you believe in what you're doing and you believe in who you are, it's not going to make such a difference what other people are going to think about you. And Howard knows, because chairman of our board, we have a very long list of failures. And if we try a project, there's a good chance we're going to fail. When I started in Lakewood, I said to my brother, I said, you can expect that probably 70% of what we try, we're going to fail. We failed on the prenup, right? We tried. So far. And I don't know about Kayama, but we tried to get a prenup done, couldn't get it done. And if you believe in what you're doing and you believe that Hashem put you in a position for a reason, it's not going to make a difference. You just keep plugging away. Don't be impressed by what everyone else has to say about it.
That's terrific. Thank you. That's great. Howard, you referenced a few minutes ago the experience on the Iran nuclear deal, and that leads to the next question, which is working with Jews from diverse backgrounds. And how do you bring people together, whether it's the context of Torah study or, of course, in communal affairs? And I would love to hear from you and the other panelists how you deal with bringing together coalitions of very diverse Jews.
Listen, there's no doubt that we're at a time in the American Jewish life, where unfortunately every Jew will not always think alike. We've never thought alike, and it will be difficult because of intermarriage and other reasons for us to always be one, community that's just itself. However, right? Every Jew is still responsible one for another, right? Famous paragraphs, Kol Yisrael Arevim Zeh Lazeh. We all have a responsibility for every Jew. Any Jew that has that Pintel feels responsibility for every Jew. When I do my AIPAC work, I am amazed that the two people, right, who I think, well, I'm saying this self-grandiose because I think I'm one of the best, but I'm thinking to myself, right? That's the only time I brag, when I think to myself. I think the two people who are the best at this, right, is this Orthodox Jew from Baltimore who spent 8 years going to yeshiva, who comes from a Hasidic family, and the guy from the Midwest, right, who has a junior after his name, his father was senior, who's a Reformed Jew who tells me he doesn't believe in God. He goes maybe once a year, but he belongs to a temple. He has no belief in God, but yet he is just as committed as I am to the state of Israel and the future of the Jewish people. So there are ways we can come together. We just have to find those ways, right? At the Federation, the doctor's still here, that's a way where Jews could come together, right? We're not coming together in our shuls, right? We're not davening together. We're not doing those things together. But there are so many ways we come together for the future of the Jewish people in the federations, in AIPAC, in other things in the community. Partners in Torah is a great way, which you guys do here, I know, of coming together with someone who comes from a different background of you, and they'll come together. The Jewish Challah Bake brought people together. My friend Rabbi Goldstein came up with this great idea, and there's so many ways that we could come together. We just have to be willing to look past the few differences that we have to realize that we're really one people. We've been one people for over 3,000 years, and we could continue to be one people if we just don't look at the differences and find the ways that we could work together. And spreading Torah, and what's done here in a kollel, right? And again, this comes from Rabbi Cutler's grandfather who started this, and places like this. And people always ask me, right, let me say, why am I chairman of the board of Beth Medrash Gavoa? I mean, let me be honest, none of my kids went to Beth Medrash Gavoa.
With Alex, you're invited.
Alex is invited. My son Alex is going to YU. My son's in Ner Israel. My son-in-law went to YU, right? In my family, mostly we go to college. But why am I at Beth Medrash Gavoa? Because when I became president of AIPAC, and I was always involved because I love Torah, and I traveled the country, every city I went to, right? The kollel, the rabbis, the majority of them came out of Beth Medrash Gavoa. Beth Medrash Gavoa was responsible for spreading Torah in America. And this kollel here is responsible for spreading Torah in St. Louis. And that's why me and Moshe and Rabbi Cutler came today.
Mr. Bain, as you deal with diverse congregations in the OU, what do you think are sort of the best practices as you reach out and trying to achieve consensus?
So we just had the beginning of the month of Adar, which is a time of year that is a very celebratory, happy part of the year. And in the middle of the month of Adar, we have the holiday of Purim, which is coming down the pike pretty quickly. And Purim, when you read the story of the Megillah, you begin to see that the central theme of Purim is Jewish unity. Right? The allegation made by Haman at the beginning of the story is that the Jews were spread out and dispersed, and the rabbis explained that what he's really signaling is that the Jewish people did not have unity among themselves, and that creates vulnerability, because when the Jews are not unified, we're vulnerable. And the solution, the antidote that Esther sent to the Jewish people was, let Knossos call you, then bring everybody together. Let's all bring unity back to the table, and then we'll be able to overcome our challenges. So my Rebbe, Rav Yaakov Weinberg, Zecher Tzadok Livracha, asked an incredible question. He says, it's an interesting thing in the Jewish law, there's one holiday, only one holiday during the course of the year, where half of the Jewish people keep the holiday on one day, and the other parts of the Jewish people keep the holiday on a different date. Because the Torah, the Gemara tells us that if you lived in a certain type of city, you keep Purim on one day, and if you lived in a city that had a wall around it from way back, you keep it the next day. So he says, isn't that an anomaly? If we're talking about Jewish unity, and that's the central theme of the holiday, that should be the very holiday in which half of the Jewish people keep one day, and half of the Jewish people keep another day, that's expressly the time that everybody should be doing things the same. And Weinberg taught us that anybody who would ask that question would only ask that question if they don't understand what unity means. Because every Jew agrees that this person should keep it on this day, and this person should keep it on another day. That's unity. Unity is when we appreciate that we have different roles, and we have different backgrounds, and we come from different places, and therefore we do things a little bit differently than each other. He says, don't ever mix up unity with uniformity. We believe in Jewish unity, but we don't believe in Jewish uniformity. And that's how we're able to take in the Orthodox Union the multiple communities with enormously different backgrounds, propensities, and interests, and all work together as one union.
That's great. Thank you. Rabbi Cutler, when you think back to when your institution was a little bit smaller than perhaps it is today, and at that time when you confronted the challenge of, hey, we have a great idea, but we don't have the money, right? How did you deal with that challenge? I mean, you can have the greatest ideas in the world, but if you don't have the funding, it doesn't do you much good. So how do you approach that?
I'm not really sure what changed. So I think it's the same thing today. We never have the money for the things we want to do because the list of things we want to do is so long. But I think that money really is a symptom and is not a cause nor an effect. It's just a symptom. If you have a mission and you really believe in it, there will be others who are going to believe in it with you. And if they're not paying attention to this project or program that's really important, then you've got to go out and you have to talk to them and share with them, exchange, converse, until they too begin to believe in it. And if you have enough people who believe in something, you're going to find the funding. So I think when you have a project that doesn't have enough money, a different way of looking at it is you can say, why are there not enough people who are ready to believe in this, and what do we need to do to create that groundswell of support so that we can launch that project? And of course, as in any institution, any organization, I saw the logos up on of the Kollel here, and I'm astounded at the variety of projects that the Kollel is doing. And what I saw here was a diversity of projects. So there's the Surf and Turf, or Turf and Learn, I forget what it was.
Not surf and turf.
Yeah, I know.
Not
It's
surf
a
and
joke.
turf. Okay.
That's what they do on the New Jersey shore.
We know. But you've got all these great projects, and the heart of each of those projects are that there are people here who really, really believe in them and are going to come out and they're going to rally their friends, they're going to rally their husbands, rally their wives, rally their kids, and they're going to get other people to really back it. So if any of you have a community-minded idea, go out there. Don't be bashful. Don't be afraid to sell it. I want to close with a few bizarre experiences that I had encapsulated in one. I've had a few times where evangelical Christians tried to convert me. And what I learned from that was, and it wasn't just in the Midwest, what I learned from that was they believed so strongly in their ideas that at the drop of a yarmulke or at the drop of a hat, they were ready to go ahead and to try to sell me on it. And you mentioned before Zev Wolfson. He believed so passionately in his ideas that his entire life was selling them. So if you have something and you don't have enough money for it, if you believe in it, go out there and sell it, and Hashem is going to give you hatzlacha with it.
Great advice. Excellent advice. So I think this question is on a lot of people's minds, and one of the peculiarities of the Orthodox world is it seems that we have the reverse of the frequent flyer program, meaning the more parents spend, right, the less of a deal they seem to get, right? And so the question is, this tuition crisis that seems to be afflicting the community, what are some innovative models? What can be done about it? Are there new approaches that need to be considered? I'll go back to you,
Sure.
Rabbi Cutler, and then ask the others to comment as well.
Well, Howard, Moshe, and I share a common belief that the best ROI for the Jewish people, I think, is to invest in government advocacy. And we're paying double and triple taxes. So if you have a family, 4 or 5 kids in yeshiva and private school, you're also paying for your public schools. We're paying double and triple. And that's before we factor in any higher cost of living that we have as religious Jews. And we have to go out there and make that case. Government advocacy has transformed the landscape in many states. I know the OU's work down in Florida. I know in Ohio, Agudath Israel has done tremendous work in Ohio, Illinois, Indiana. There are families that move to Cleveland because of government vouchers. It doesn't have to be vouchers. There's many different ways to skin the cat, but the best ROI for a community to help with tuition challenges is to invest in government advocacy. In my belief, and I've seen Moshe do it, I've seen the OU, I've seen, of course, AIPAC do it on the Israel level, and Agudath Israel do it, Chabad Lubavitch. We all work together on Capitol Hill. It's the best way to help struggling families who are paying for a yeshiva education and for public schools and all the other taxes of life.
Excellent. Thank you. Any other comments?
No, I think we're all on the same page in that regard. You know, it's one of the few areas that there is enormous overlap and effort because so much effort is required. The Beis Medrash Gavoa and the OU and the Aguda and many other enterprises are all working in this regard with regard to government funding because, you know, I'll tell you an interesting story. Many years ago, my wife and I landed up in Duluth, Minnesota for Shabbos. How we landed up there is a whole story. There were 8 men, other than myself and our friend who was a rabbi in Minneapolis, who brought us to spend Shabbos there. And we made the minyan, the rabbi and myself with the other 8 fellows. It's just an interesting side point. So of the other 8 fellows, the average age was about 87, except for one fellow who was in his 40s. And I said to the younger fellow, well, what are you doing here in Duluth, Minnesota? He said, well, you see that fellow, he's my father, and we have a meatpacking plant here in Duluth. I go, it's kosher? He goes, yeah, it's kosher. I say, kosher meatpacking? How do you make a living in northern Minnesota? Duluth is 2.5 hours north of Minneapolis. He goes, well, I got to tell you the truth, we have a lot of Muslim customers, and that's part of our sustenance. He goes, in fact, that morning, he says, that morning we just got an order from one of our Muslim customers for half of a cow, and I went around telling everybody in the shop that we just got an order this morning for Chatzi Halal. But when you went around to the shul, there were pictures on the walls of shul dinners in the 1950s. Now, this shul was a cathedral synagogue. It was gorgeous. The architecture, the landscaping, the building was unbelievably beautiful. And on the walls of the social hall were photos of dinners in which there were 100 to 200 men with beards and black hats. And I went over to one of the older men and said, is this really of this synagogue? He goes, there were 5 synagogues in Duluth in the 1950s, each one of them packed every Shabbos. I came home after Shabbos saying to myself, well, why? Why did Duluth fail and other communities thrived? And I began to look at it and analyze it and do some digging, and it became very clear. The error they made in Duluth, Minnesota, was they built beautiful synagogues. And the communities that thrive are those that build beautiful schools. We live on the backs, on the shoulders of our day school movement. And therefore, it's critical when you ask this question. Of course, it's a burden on parents. Of course, it's a burden on our community. But without our day school system, without making that extra effort to make sure that we send our children to the proper day schools, we won't have anything to worry about in the next generation. So it's a double-edged sword. On one hand, it's a tremendous difficulty, and we all have to work hard to try to alleviate the pressure on the young family trying to start out and send their children to school. But we can't keep on talking about how difficult it is. You know, there's a very famous line that was attributed to the great 20th century Gadol, Rav Moshe Feinstein, who said that one of the reasons that so many Jews in mid-century New York left Orthodox Judaism is because they kept on hearing their parents say, Schwer zu sein a Yid. It's difficult to be a Jew. And the kids finally said, look, if it's so difficult, then forget about it. And they abandoned Judaism. So we talk about the tuition crisis, we talk about how difficult it is. We have to limit to some degree by also rejoicing in the fact that we live in a country where you could have our children getting a Jewish education, where we could build the schools that we need to keep our community alive. And we suffer and we struggle, but it's a struggle of joy.
let me put a little bit different spin on it. First of all, I agree with my friends, and we work together, that we do need more government help. We're getting in Maryland, we now get, every poor family gets $1,500 per student from the government that goes to the parents to help pay the day school tuition. It's a start, and there hopefully will be more of that coming with the advocacy. And the OU Moshe has led an incredible job doing things in Washington on that. But I think it's our fault, not the community's fault. What do I mean by that? We are living in a time where we, the collective we, have more affluence than we've ever had before in the history of our people, right? I mean, just think about it. Open the Forbes billionaires list. There's over 1 million of Shomer Shabbos people on the Forbes billionaires list. I'm not talking about the poor people with $100 or $200 or $300 million. I'm talking about the rich people with billionaires, right? And there's so much money, right? And, I'm embarrassed to say this, but at my daughter's wedding, 7 people came in private planes. Right? Let them fly commercial and do something else with the money. Now, some of them are huge body stuckers, don't get me wrong. But the point is, we have the money, right? And I grew up in a family, in a middle-class family, right? Where my first new suit came from my bar mitzvah. Why? Because every penny went to pay the 5 kids' tuition, because my father knew it was his responsibility to pay the tuition. But we're not there today, right? We're in a place of affluence, and we spend our money and we give it to so many places. The concentration of our money has to go back to our yeshivas and our Jewish day schools, right? There are so many nice things to give money to, and I'm for all of it. But either we give a little bit more, or we reallocate a little bit. We are rich enough, and I can't talk for every community, but as a national community, we are rich enough that there should be no tuition crisis, that there should be enough money. You know, when I talk to Rabbi Cutler about the people in Kollel, and people say, you should learn in Kollel, right? You know what? I don't think everyone should be learning forever. But with 10 billionaires and our community with trillions of dollars, right? The fact that we have total, to include the Hasidic and everyone, 13,000 people learning in Kollel in America, and the average guy learns for 5 years. But we can't afford that Torah as a community? Of course we could afford it. Just like we could afford to give every single one of our children a Jewish education. We just have to want to do it. And I believe we're able to do it if we just put our minds to it and our resources to it.
Excellent. Okay, we're at the top of the hour, final question. So you should know that using this very advanced technology from Rabbi Mintz, that was the #1 question from the audience, was the tuition question. By only 1 vote, the second most important question was about restaurants, okay? Now, as you may have heard, St. Louis has, shall we say, a limited culinary community in terms of kosher restaurants. And so I think people are looking for advice in how should the community address that challenge. Any ideas for how St. Louis can augment its selection of fine kosher dining?
Well, Howard Street told me before that if we have 10 billionaires, the amount of food we could buy is so much, there should be plenty of restaurants available for all of us.
I think you're on your way there. Listen, I'm very close to some people in Cincinnati. And I went there when it was a midbar. And I see the 3 kosher restaurants they have now because they brought in a kollel and they put tons of money in building up the day schools in the kollel. And you'll be on your way. As long as your kollel guys, which is what they've been successful in doing, stay in town and don't go back east, right? That's a way you build a community, right? Affordable housing. The restaurants are only going to come. No one's sponsoring a restaurant, right? The restaurants are going to come as you grow your community. Right? When you're learning and you're building Torah, from that comes the lishma of getting a good kosher restaurant. So my bracha to you is that the kollel and the community and everything will grow by set streets. Now, I don't have that problem. This is only my 2nd time in St. Louis. I was here a bunch of years ago, and I had the delicious dinner at the home of Heschel and Adina Vasquez, which Adina cooked for me last time I was here. So I now have 2 delicious dinners here in St. Louis. I'm very happy.
I can second that. Well, thank you all for coming. We're very, very grateful for your expertise and insights. And please, everyone, thank our panelists. We're great evening. Thank you.